There are moments in life when you realize, in the space between one breath and the next, that everything you've accepted as normal was, in fact, a slow, deliberate betrayal wrapped in polite smiles and passed-off comments meant to keep you small. I had that moment on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in our family's crumbling kitchen, surrounded by the smell of overbrewed tea and the sound of rain pelting the windows like 1,000 whispered warnings. My mother stood by the stove, her back to me, stirring something that smelled like memories I didn't want to revisit, overcooked chicken stew, the kind she made when we were broke, cold, and pretending we were a family. She didn't look up as she said the words that changed everything. "You're just a woman, darling. You'll marry and leave, like all girls do. That house belongs to your brother. It's only right." I remember the tea mug in my hand trembling slightly, the ceramic clinking just enough to betray the fury blooming in my gut like wildfire. My fingers tightened around it, not to throw it, not yet, but to anchor myself to something solid while my mother's words sliced through me, clean and precise like a scalpel. Across the room, Derek sat like he always did, arms behind his head, that lazy grin smeared across his face like he'd earned the damn thing. "Makes sense to me," he said with a shrug, the entitlement in his voice so natural, it was almost lyrical. I had spent my entire adult life clawing my way up from beneath the weight of other people's expectations, nursing school, double shifts, paying bills that weren't mine, and never once asking for recognition. While Derek drank beer and changed majors like socks, I built a life brick by brick with bleeding hands and a spine made of borrowed steel. But none of that mattered, apparently, because I was a woman. And women, according to my family, were meant to carry weight silently and then vanish when the real legacy was handed out. I should have screamed. I should have slammed that mug on the ground and shattered it into 1,000 ceramic shards just to make a sound louder than my mother's silence and Derek's smugness. But I didn't. I smiled. That dangerous, practice smile that women like me wear when we're calculating how many more insults we'll stomach before we turn into something no one can recognize. "Of course," I said, my voice smooth as honey and twice as toxic. "That makes perfect sense." Inside, something cracked so violently I thought the echo might crawl out of my throat and rip through the air between us. But I stayed calm. That was my superpower, composure so tight it could strangle gods. I nodded, excused myself, and walked out of the room with the same quiet grace I'd perfected since childhood, when I was told good girls don't make scenes, even when their hearts are being dismembered at the dinner table. The next day, I drove across town to finalize the paperwork for the home I'd spent years saving for. 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors, sunlight in every window like God himself had decided to be kind for once. It wasn't just a house. It was a declaration. A fortress. A promise to myself that I would never again sit quietly while someone decided I was temporary. As I sat across from the real estate agent, a man with the kind of smile that assumed I had a husband waiting in the car, I felt the weight of my family's expectations pressing against my chest. He handed me a pen and said, "You sure you don't want to wait until your brother can co-sign?" And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just about my mother or Derek. It was about a world that still couldn't quite accept that a woman might buy her own damn castle without a king to validate the deed. I smiled at him too. I was getting good at that. "No need," I said, signing my name in ink so bold it could have been blood. I walked out of that office with keys in my hand and fire in my bones. I didn't cry. Not even once. I drove straight to the new house, stepped inside, and for the first time in my life, exhaled without apology. The silence was different there. It wasn't hollow, it was peaceful, like a stage waiting for the first act of a play only I knew how to write. That night, my parents came over. They brought a pie, the store-bought kind that was supposed to pass as a warm gesture. My mother walked through the house with the expression of someone critiquing a hotel room that wasn't quite up to par. My father stood by the window, nodding absently, as though he hadn't once told me that a woman's real worth was measured in how little trouble she caused. Then the conversation came, cloaked in faux concern, dipped in nostalgia, and served with a smile. "It's such a lovely home, sweetheart," my mother said, adjusting a photo frame I hadn't finished unpacking. "But have you thought about putting it in Derek's name?" "Just for the sake of security, keeping things in the family." I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just looked at her, really looked, and wondered if she had any idea how far I'd come from the girl she raised, the one who used to bite her tongue until it bled just to keep the peace. "That's an interesting idea," I said, the lie slipping out so smoothly I almost believed it myself. "I'll definitely think about it." She nodded, satisfied. My father patted Derek on the back like he'd just won something. I stood there with a smile on my face and a storm behind my ribs. They had no idea. Later that night, I sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded by boxes and the smell of fresh paint, and I let the silence settle over me like armor. I opened my laptop, created a new document, and labeled it Plan. The first line I typed was simple: smile until they're blind, then strike when they're deaf. Because this wasn't just about a house. This wasn't just about being dismissed. This was about every time I was told to be quiet, to wait my turn, to give until I had nothing left and then thank them for the chance. I had waited long enough. There's a peculiar kind of satisfaction that comes when you finally learn to weaponize the very expectations that once suffocated you. When you look your betrayers in the eyes and smile sweetly, knowing you fed them a lie so convincingly that they now wear it like a badge of honor, not realizing it's the very chain that will strangle them later. That's where I was calm, controlled, calculating, playing the role of the loyal daughter while digging the foundation of a future they'd never get to touch. After closing on the house, I didn't celebrate. I didn't drink champagne or invite friends over for a tour or post smiling pictures online to announce my independence to the world. Instead, I drove back to my childhood home that night, my parents' house, and sat at the kitchen table while my mother sliced peaches like she hadn't just spent the past decade slicing into my dignity one condescending remark at a time. I told them I'd done it, that the paperwork was almost finalized and that, yes, I had taken their advice and listed Derek as the co-owner. My father smiled in that way he always did when he thought I'd finally done something right, like obedience was some rare prize that must be acknowledged with a grunt of approval. My mother clasped her hands together, eyes glinting with pride that wasn't about me at all, but about what she could now parade around town like a shiny sacrifice to the gods of tradition. "She's such a good girl," she said later that night during a phone call I wasn't meant to overhear, her voice syrupy and smug. "Knows her place. Doing the right thing, finally." I listened to her from the hallway, my breath slow, my pulse steady, my hand curled around the banister like it might snap. But I didn't react. Not outwardly. Because my performance was only beginning, and I needed every ounce of their confidence if the ending was going to be as satisfying as I envisioned. The very next morning, I booked a consultation with a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but a woman who specialized in asset protection, legacy trusts, and airtight contractual silences. Her office smelled like old money and new vengeance. Her name was Evelyn Grant, and she had the sharp eyes of someone who didn't waste time on people too afraid to fight for what was theirs. I told her everything: my family, the manipulation, the pressure to surrender my future into someone else's name, and she didn't blink once. "So you want a trust," she said, her tone clinical but not unkind. "Not just a name on a deed. You want total isolation of ownership." "Yes," I said, without hesitation, my voice steady and certain. "I want it to be mine and mine alone. Legally untouchable. Irrevocable." She nodded, already scribbling on a yellow notepad, her pen cutting across the page like a knife. "We'll make it so if anyone even thinks about challenging it, they'll find themselves choking on paperwork for years." It took 3 meetings to finalize everything. The trust was established under my name alone, with a layered structure that ensured not even a court order from a desperate sibling or a conniving parent could unravel it without bleeding themselves dry in legal fees. Evelyn filed the real deed under the trust while I worked on creating the illusion they needed to stay convinced. That's when the performance began in earnest. I printed out a falsified co-ownership agreement, just polished enough to look legitimate, but fake enough that no lawyer on earth could enforce it. I tucked it inside a folder and presented it to my parents during dinner, casually sliding it across the table like it was nothing more than a formality. My mother's eyes lit up the moment she saw Derek's name on the front page. She didn't read beyond the first line. She didn't ask questions. She just called it proof that you're not selfish after all. Derek, of course, grinned like a wolf handed a lamb on a silver plate. He didn't thank me. He didn't question the logistics. He just launched into a speech about the pool he planned to build in the backyard, how he'd finally have a place to entertain friends, maybe throw parties, maybe even install a hot tub in the side corner if the zoning allowed it. I nodded, sipped my wine, and smiled like the sweet little girl they thought they still owned. Letting them believe they were winning was the most delicious part. Every time my mother bragged to her bridge group about her selfless daughter, I nodded and offered tea. Every time my father hinted at how Derek could move in eventually, just to take care of the place, I smiled and asked what kind of furniture he'd bring. Every time Derek laughed and said things like, "I'll take the master bedroom once you move out," I congratulated him like the obedient fool they wanted me to be. They never suspected a thing. In public, I played the part so well that even I started to marvel at how convincing my performance had become. I volunteered for family errands. I brought groceries to their house. I offered to help Derek pick out potential contractors for his imaginary renovations. I baked pies. I made spreadsheets. I sent fake email updates from a non-existent bank account that I claimed we'd use to manage the mortgage. Every move I made was calculated to deepen their delusion. Behind the curtain, though, I was preparing something far more permanent. I kept receipts. I stored emails. I logged conversations in a digital journal with timestamps and audio recordings. Not because I planned to use them yet, but because I believed in the value of a paper trail when you were building something designed to outlast betrayal. The deeper they sank into comfort, the more dangerous I became. One afternoon, I caught Derek walking the backyard of my house with a friend, pointing at areas of the fence and talking about where he'd install his pool. He didn't know I was watching from the kitchen window. I stood there with my coffee growing cold in my hands and my smile curling slowly into something that didn't belong in a family photograph. He was building dreams on a foundation I had salted behind his back. And I loved it. The next week, my mother hosted a small gathering for some of her neighbors and old church friends. She insisted on holding it at my new home, saying it would be such a good look for her to showcase the home her daughter had so graciously signed over to her brother. I agreed, of course, with a smile, with open arms. I let her stand in my living room and tell a crowd of women in pastel cardigans how proud she was that I knew my role and wasn't clinging to things meant for men to carry forward. I served lemonade and passed around little hors d'oeuvres while every woman in that room nodded approvingly, completely unaware that the deed sitting in my safe might as well have been a death certificate for the illusion they were swallowing whole. Later that evening, when the guests had gone and the house smelled like fading perfume and old perfume, I found my mother standing by the front window, her face full of rare contentment. "You did the right thing," she said, not even bothering to thank me. "This family, it has structure now. We can finally rest easy." I nodded, my lips parting in a slow grin that I let linger just long enough to burn the edges of my teeth. "Of course," I said. "Anything for the family." In my bedroom, the trust documents rested in a fireproof lockbox, sealed and certified, with contingencies built in for every possible manipulation I could foresee. They had no idea that the trap had already closed, quietly, softly, without a sound. They thought I was building Derek's future. But what I was really building was their reckoning. There are moments in life when you get to watch the world you've been forced to crawl beneath tilt on its axis, when the balance of power shifts not with a scream or a war drum, but with a microphone, a wine glass, and the kind of smile only vengeance can sharpen. That moment for me came on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, when the sun was high, The champagne was chilled, and every person who had once told me to step aside gathered under my roof thinking they were about to witness a coronation. I had spent weeks planning the event with the kind of precision most people reserve for wedding receptions or military operations. Every detail mattered, every flower arrangement, every hors d'oeuvre, every strategically placed photograph on the walls reminding everyone exactly whose name belonged in this space. The invitations had gone out by mail, not text, printed on thick paper that hinted at wealth, stability, permanence. They said housewarming, but what I was really warming was the stage for a reckoning they never saw coming. My mother arrived first, dressed in the lavender chiffon dress she reserved for church luncheons and funerals, both events where she could wield judgment behind a smile. She walked through the front door like she owned the place, pausing to compliment the crown molding and the antique mirror I had deliberately hung in the entryway. It was my grandmother's mirror, the one she promised me before she passed, the one my mother tried to give to Derek instead. I had reclaimed it quietly, just as I had everything else they thought I didn't deserve. Derek came next, flanked by two friends I barely recognized, boys in overpriced shoes with inherited swagger, laughing too loud, taking up too much space. He slapped me on the back and handed me a bottle of wine like it was some ceremonial offering. "Big day, huh?" he said, grinning. "Ready to make it official?" I nodded, thanked him for the wine, and told him his seat was right up front, center stage, best view in the house. He beamed, oblivious. The rest of the family trickled in over the next hour, uncles, cousins, the neighbor who used to report every teenage boy I brought home to my parents like she was doing the Lord's work. They all arrived with smiles and congratulations, not knowing they were walking into a trap designed not to harm, but to reveal. That's always been the thing with people like them. They never see women like me as architects. Only caretakers. Only placeholders. I had rented a small podium and set it at the end of the living room, just before the sliding glass doors that opened to the backyard. A screen behind it displayed a loop of home videos I'd edited myself, footage of me painting the house, signing the closing documents, planting flowers, lifting furniture. I made sure every image showed no one but me. No Derek. No man at my side. By the time the food had been served and the wine had begun to loosen tongues, the energy in the room shifted. My mother was already bragging to a cluster of old friends near the buffet. I heard her say, "She really came around." It's not easy, handing over something like this, but she knew what was right. My father stood with Derek near the fireplace, talking pool installation like the place had already been turned over. Everyone was waiting for a handoff. They had dressed for a coronation. They had brought gifts for a king. I stood by the archway for a long minute, sipping my drink, letting the moment breathe before I suffocated it with truth. Then I walked to the podium. The room went quiet in that strange way only family can fall silent, noisy bodies suddenly holding their breath, waiting to see who would be praised, who would be punished, who would be handed power. I tapped the microphone gently. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady, measured, firm. "This has been a long journey, and I appreciate every person who showed up today to celebrate what this house represents." There were nods. A few claps. Derek raised his glass. I continued, pausing just long enough to draw the silence taut. "Many of you have been under the impression that today is not just a housewarming, but a handoff. That this home, my home, is being transferred, gifted, passed down like some relic of tradition from one generation to the next." Now the nods slowed. Eyes narrowed. I smiled. That was never the plan. A beat. "This house," I said, my voice ringing louder now, bouncing off walls built by my sacrifice and my sleepless nights, was bought, renovated, and legally secured by me and me alone. Not co-owned. Not borrowed. Not held in some invisible trust for someone else to step into when I'm finally deemed finished. Gasps rippled like a stone dropped in still water. My mother went rigid. My father blinked, stunned. Derek's grin evaporated into something brittle and confused. I raised my hand and clicked a small remote. The screen behind me changed. A document appeared, blown up, in crystal clarity. "This," I said, pointing without looking, "is the irrevocable legal trust holding the deed to this property. It is registered under my name. It cannot be altered, contested, or reassigned. No part of this home belongs to anyone else. Not my brother. Not my parents. Not anyone standing in this room." The silence cracked, splintered, and gave way to a low hum of shock. My mother stepped forward, her face pale beneath the makeup she had so carefully applied. "But you said," she began, her voice shaky, foreign. "I said what you needed to hear," I interrupted, my tone still even. "Because that's all I've ever been to you, a conduit for comfort, a vessel for dreams that weren't mine, a name to be signed away when it became convenient." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish tossed on a dock. "You faked the documents?" "No," I said. "I gave you a page of fiction and you built your fantasy on it. That's not my fault." I turned back to the screen and clicked again. More documents. Legal signatures. Filing dates. The trust terms spelled out in language so clear even my father, who always claimed to know a guy, couldn't argue with it. "This is the truth," I said. Cold, inked, notarized truth. While you were planning renovations, I was protecting myself. While you were taking credit, I was taking control. While you were gloating, I was building a legacy none of you will ever own. The room was dead quiet now. Eyes wide, jaws slack. I raised my glass. "And so, here's my toast," I said, my voice stronger than it had ever been, the words cut from steel and shaped with purpose. "To every daughter told she was temporary. To every girl handed a broom instead of a deed. To every woman expected to build someone else's kingdom with her bare hands and broken back." I paused, letting the silence fall heavy once more. "To all the daughters told they don't belong, may you build your own kingdoms. May they have iron gates. And may those who once dismissed you find themselves locked outside." I drank, and the room shattered. The silence after the toast was thick with disbelief, the kind that clings to the skin like smoke after a fire, the kind that suffocates the ones who had grown fat and lazy off the comfort of control. They stood there, my parents, my brother, the distant cousins and fair-weather relatives, shocked not just by the truth, but by the realization that I had orchestrated it right under their noses while wearing the costume of a dutiful daughter. But they had no idea the final act hadn't even begun. You see, vengeance is rarely satisfying when delivered all at once. It's most potent when it lingers, slow-burning, long after the supposed storybook ending. They thought I had closed the book when I claimed the house. They thought the microphone, the trust papers, the glass of champagne, the toasted daughters were my final move. But what they didn't know, what I had buried beneath layers of obedience and feigned gratitude, was that this house, the one they coveted so greedily, wasn't the only one I held the keys to. In fact, it wasn't even the first. 3 months before I purchased this home, the house I now stood in, declaring dominion over, I had walked into a county records office with a folder of documents passed down to me in an envelope yellowed with age and heavy with secrets. My grandmother had given it to me on the last day I saw her, her hand frail, her voice a brittle whisper as she pressed it into my palm. "Use it when you're ready," she had said, her eyes sharp even through the fog of her final days. And not a minute before. Inside that envelope was a copy of the title deed to my childhood home, the house my parents had ruled like a kingdom carved from their own narcissism. A house I'd scrubbed floors in. A house I'd watched them prioritize Derek in. A house where I had eaten silence for dinner and betrayal for dessert. That house had been passed down from my grandmother, not directly to my parents, as they'd long believed, but to me, through a quiet legal provision executed when I was barely 12 years old. They never noticed. They never even bothered to check. They assumed ownership was theirs by right, not by law. And I let them believe it. Until I didn't. At that records office, the clerk confirmed what I already knew. My name was on the title. My name alone. It had been all along. Which meant I had every legal right to sell it. And that's exactly what I did. Quietly, efficiently, without a single word to them. The buyers were a young couple from out of state, sweet, hopeful, grateful to find a home in such a difficult market. I priced it fairly, insisted on a clean inspection, and made sure the proceeds were deposited into a discreet account under a legal entity tied to a philanthropic cause I hadn't yet revealed to anyone. When the final wire cleared, I didn't pop champagne. I didn't celebrate with friends. I simply opened my laptop, reviewed the trust's standing, and smiled at the thought of what that money would become. Because revenge that ends with personal gain is sweet. But revenge that fuels a revolution? That's transcendent. Which brings me to the final curtain today, this room, this housewarming party that had already flipped their world once. I waited until they began to move again, until they started whispering to each other in strained voices, trying to piece together the ruin of their assumptions. I let them believe the drama had climaxed and the story had concluded. Then I stepped back to the mic. "I want to thank you again for coming," I said, my voice silk over steel, as calm as the eye of a storm. "But before you go, there's one more thing I'd like to share, something even more important than this house, or this toast, or even the name on the title." Every face turned back toward me, confused, expectant, unsettled. I clicked the remote once more. The screen behind me changed to a new document, another deed, stamped and sealed, showing my name not on this house, but on the home where they still thought they lived like royalty. I let the silence stretch again, long enough for realization to slither through the cracks of their pride. "This," I said, "is the title to the family home." Gasps again. My mother stumbled back a step. My father's mouth dropped open. Derek narrowed his eyes like the floor had suddenly gone soft beneath him. "You told me that house was yours," I continued, each word cutting clean, "that it was your legacy, your domain, your gift to Derek when the time came." Another click. The document faded into an image, an email confirmation of the home sale, complete with buyer signatures and escrow confirmation. "I sold it 3 months ago," I said. "Legally. Quietly. Permanently." My mother made a sound, half gasp, half moan, like she'd been punched somewhere beneath the ribcage. My father shook his head, his voice finally finding volume. "That's impossible. That's fraud." "No," I replied, my tone flat and deadly calm. "That's what happens when you don't bother to read the papers your own mother filed before she died." I looked at them one by one, the people who had raised me not with love, but with leashes. I looked into their eyes and saw fear, not because they had lost something material, but because for the first time, they were realizing I had never been what they thought. I was not a burden. I was not an extra. I was not a placeholder. I was the blade they sharpened with every insult. And I had finally drawn it. "I used the proceeds," I said, gesturing toward the screen once more, which now displayed a website with a bold, elegant logo, "to fund a foundation. It's called Iron Daughters." A few murmurs. Confusion rippled again. "It's a nonprofit that provides legal aid, housing support, and job placement for women escaping toxic family structures," I said. "For girls raised to believe they were only valuable as long as they served." My mother was crying now, silent tears running down cheeks that had once smirked at my small victories. My father had gone quiet. Derek looked away, shame and fury dueling on his face. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said, voice low now, intimate, like a warning meant only for them. "I'm doing this because someone has to stop pretending that survival is enough. I'm done surviving. I'm building." Then I walked toward the front of the room, raised my glass once more, and said the words that would be carved into the bones of everyone listening long after I left. "You told me I'd marry and leave," I said, smiling with teeth. "You were half right. I left. But I married myself to my future." The room didn't clap. It didn't have to. I turned toward the door. I didn't look back. And as I crossed the threshold of a house that belonged only to me, I spoke the final truth, the one that would echo long after the lights dimmed and the whispers died. When they called me selfish, I smiled. Because this time, It was finally true.